5 years had not changed the square, but they had changed her completely. Arabella Vane stood at the edge of Cavendish Square on a Tuesday morning in October, a leather satchel in her left hand and a list of creditor appointments in her right, dressed in a coat the color of pewter that she had bought with her own money, from her own account, at a shop on New Bond Street where no one had asked her to explain herself. The morning was cold and clear. The plane trees had turned. A delivery cart rattled over the cobblestones, and a pair of nursemaids with perambulators moved along the far footpath at a measured pace, and Arabella noted all of this and none of it, because her attention was already occupied by the item at the top of her list, which was a meeting with a wool merchant on Henrietta Street at 10:30, and her attention was a well-managed thing that she did not permit to scatter. She was 27 years old. She had been managing her own affairs for 3 of those years without assistance, and the 2 before that with very little, and the 5 before that with none at all, that she had not manufactured herself. She walked with the particular composure of a woman who had stopped performing composure and simply become it, the way a road becomes level after years of being traveled. She did not see him until she was halfway across the square. He was standing near the central garden, his back 3/4 to her, speaking with another man in a dark greatcoat. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown accustomed to men of smaller consequence. He wore no hat. His dark hair was the same. His coat was the color of midnight, precisely tailored, no ornamentation, the authority of it worn as naturally as his own shoulders. He had not changed in any way that could be named exactly, and yet everything about him was different in the way that 5 years always makes things different, settled into themselves, less like a question and more like a statement. Charles Beaumont, the Duke of Ashford, turned his head, and his eyes found her before she could decide whether to alter her course. She did not alter her course. She was not going to step aside for anyone. She held his gaze for precisely 3 seconds. The measurement of it was instinctive, the way all her measurements were instinctive now. And then she looked forward again and walked on, unhurried, her spine straight, her list in her hand, her satchel balanced at her side, the appointments waiting. He said nothing. She heard no footsteps following. The square was the same. The morning was the same. Only she had changed. And she understood, from the quality of the silence behind her, that he had seen it. She turned onto Henrietta Street and did not look back. 5 years before, Arabella Vane had been the kind of woman who looked back. She had been 18 years old and living in her uncle's house on the unfashionable edge of Mayfair, in a room that was neither cold enough to complain of nor warm enough to be comfortable, wearing dresses that had been her cousin Dorothea's before Dorothea had put on weight and moved on to better things. She had arrived at her Uncle Gerald's household with 2 trunks, a grief that was still raw from her father's death 4 months prior, and the slow-forming understanding that the inheritance she had believed secure had been, in the intervening months, managed away from her by a sequence of legal instruments she had not known to look for until it was too late to contest. Her father, William Vane, had been a solicitor of middling practice and extraordinary mind, a man who had kept every account in his head with the precision of a watch mechanism and had been consistently surprised when the rest of the world did not do the same. He had loved Arabella with the focused, particular attention of a man who had educated his daughter as though she were his only student and intended to keep her that way. She had learned accounts before she learned embroidery. She had understood the mechanics of a creditor negotiation before she had attended her first ball. She had read contracts for pleasure, sitting in his study on Sunday afternoons while he worked, asking questions he answered fully and without condescension, because he had understood that a girl who could ask good questions would eventually be a woman who could not be easily deceived. He had died in November of 1837, unexpectedly and without having updated his will, and the legal machinery had moved faster than grief. Her Uncle Gerald was not a cruel man. He was a man who believed in the proper arrangement of things, and the proper arrangement of things included the understanding that a girl of 18 with no dowry, no portion, and no male protector was a dependent, and dependents did not make decisions. He had given Arabella a roof, meals, a clothing allowance scaled to what Dorothea had outgrown, and the position of unpaid household manager, which was not what it was called. What it was called was nothing, because it was assumed to be simply what she did. What she actually did, in the 7 months before Charles Beaumont entered her life and the 18 months she spent inside the orbit of his household, was this. She managed the domestic accounts for a household of 11, negotiated the coal delivery contract down by 4 shillings per ton by simply reading the previous agreement and identifying the clause her uncle had never noticed, maintained the correspondence with 3 separate creditors who had been circling the household's debts with the patient attention of men who knew they would eventually be paid, and organized the seasonal rotation of the linen closet in a manner that reduced the annual replacement cost by 1/3. She did all of this before breakfast, which she ate alone in the small dining room before the family came down, and returned to it after dinner, which she served and supervised and cleared in the role of the invisible competence that keeps a household from collapsing. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like acknowledgement. The first time she had understood herself clearly, not as her uncle saw her, not as Dorothea saw her, but as she actually was on a Wednesday in March of 1838, when the coal merchant had arrived to inform her uncle that the renegotiated contract was, in his opinion, irregular, and her uncle had looked at Arabella and said, with genuine puzzlement, "Did you do this?" And she had said simply, "Yes. We were paying above market rate, we are no longer." And her uncle had looked at the merchant and then back at her, and had experienced, for a moment, the particular discomfort of a man who has been managing something he has just discovered he was not, in fact, managing. He had thanked her. He had not changed anything. She had picked up her list and continued. She had been doing this for 1.5 years when Charles Beaumont came to dinner. He had come because her Uncle Gerald was distantly acquainted with the Duke's family solicitor, and the solicitor had arranged an introduction of some ambiguous professional purpose, and Charles had attended the dinner in the manner of a man completing an obligation that his secretary had scheduled before he had time to decline it. He was 24 years old. He had been the Duke of Ashford for 3 years, inherited from a father who had left the estate in a condition that was politely described as encumbered, and more accurately described as 4 years from collapse. He was not accustomed to dining on the unfashionable edge of Mayfair. He was accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered, which he was, and to having that importance organized around him in such a way that he could neither doubt it nor benefit from it, which he had been finding, in the 3 years since his father died, increasingly exhausting. Arabella had served the dinner. She had not been introduced. She had been introduced to no one for so long that she had stopped noticing. This was what she told herself. But the truth was more precise than that. She had noticed Charles Beaumont noticing her, and had found the experience so unfamiliar that she had not known where to put it, and had put it in the pocket of her apron along with her list and the receipt from the morning's market, and had forgotten about it until later. What he had noticed, specifically, was the moment she had corrected the footman's placement of the dessert service without interrupting the conversation at the table, rearranging 5 pieces of silver with 3 quiet, precise movements that shifted the whole arrangement and produced no sound. He had watched this from his position at the table with the focused attention of a man who has just heard a note played in perfect pitch in a room full of noise, and he had looked at her, and she had not looked back, and he had returned to the conversation with something new in his expression that his host had not noticed, and that Arabella, who was already at the sideboard, had not seen. He had asked her uncle for her name before he left. Her uncle had provided it with the mild puzzlement of a man asked to name a piece of furniture he had never considered giving a name. "Arabella," he had said, "my niece." She had still been at the sideboard. She had heard this. She had pressed one hand briefly against the cool wood of the server, and then returned to stacking the plates. That was the beginning. She had not known it then. Not exactly. She had known only that something had shifted in the room's arrangement. The way a piece of furniture moved 3 inches reveals a patch of floor that had previously been covered. Charles Beaumont had sent his solicitor the following week with a proposal. Not a romantic proposal, a professional one. His estate at Ashford Park in Wiltshire had been in administrative disarray for 3 years. His steward was aging. His accounts were inconsistent. His tenants were beginning to find alternate markets for their wool. And what he required was someone who could look at the whole system with clear eyes and tell him exactly what was wrong. The solicitor had been instructed to find such a person. The solicitor had, upon reflection and following a conversation with the coal merchant's clerk, arrived at Arabella Vane. She had read the terms of engagement in 20 minutes, identified 3 clauses that required amendment, written her proposed changes in the margin in her neat, compact hand, and sent the document back with a note that said, "I will accept these terms with the 3 amendments noted. I am available to begin the Monday following." She had not asked her uncle's permission. He had not noticed. She had arrived at Ashford Park on a Monday morning in October of 1838, 2 years before the moment in Cavendish Square when everything began again, with a leather satchel and a list of questions, and the quiet understanding that she was walking into a household that had not yet decided what to make of her, and that the decision would depend entirely on what she did in the first 2 weeks. She had been right about that. What she had not anticipated, what she had not permitted herself to anticipate, because she was a woman who had learned to keep her ledger columns clean of entries she could not afford, was Charles. She did not permit herself to think about what had happened in those 18 months, standing on Henrietta Street with her October appointments, and her pewter coat, and 5 years of distance arranged between herself and that particular accounting. There were things she had balanced and put away. She was very good at putting things away. The wool merchant's office smelled of lanolin and old ledgers, which she found, as she always did, comforting. She settled into the chair across from Mr. Tate, opened her satchel, and placed 3 documents on the desk between them in a precise row, oldest on the left, most recent on the right. "You've overpaid on the October delivery by 11 shillings and 4pence, she said, indicating the second document. "The weight notation doesn't match the delivery receipt. I'd like to discuss the contract for the spring quarter, and I'd like to have that 11 shillings and 4pence credited before we do." Mr. Tate looked at the documents and then at her, and then back at the documents and said nothing for a moment. This was what happened. It always happened. She had learned not to fill the silence. She had managed the accounts of Pemberton Consulting, a small, precise firm that provided estate management advisory services to the minor gentry and the occasional merchant family, for 3 years now, from a set of rooms on Dover Street that she paid for herself. She had built the practice from a single client referral from a retired solicitor named Edward Fanshawe, who had encountered her work indirectly through a letter of professional reference that she had written for herself and sent, without particular expectation, to 4 advisory firms in the autumn of 1840, when she had finally left Ashford Park. 3 had not replied. 1 had. Edward Fanshawe had been its senior partner, then 64 years old, with the measured skepticism of a man who had spent 40 years watching capable people fail and incompetent ones succeed through social connection. And he had read her annotated accounts for Ashford Park with the particular attention of someone encountering evidence of a skill he had not expected in the package it arrived in. He had offered her a position. She had negotiated the terms in one afternoon and begun on the following Monday. She had not counted on Edward Fanshawe any more than she counted on anything that merely looked like rescue. But he had been something better than rescue. He had been a fair witness, and she had found that rarer and more valuable than any protection she had been offered before. He had retired 18 months ago, and Pemberton Consulting was now hers in practice, if not yet in law. They were in the middle of the documentation for that, and she managed 11 client accounts, employed 2 junior clerks, and occupied rooms on Dover Street that were warm, ordered, and entirely her own. She was not a woman who needed to be seen. She had long since stopped requiring that from the world. She simply preferred, on the whole, to be accurate. Charles Beaumont had spent 5 years in the kind of deliberate motion that a man undertakes when he is working toward something he has not yet named to himself. He had completed the renovation of Ashford Park, the thing that Arabella's work had made possible. The accounts she had stabilized, the tenant agreements she had renegotiated, the steward rotation she had restructured, all of it the foundation on which the estate now stood. He had done this properly, which was to say efficiently and without waste, and the estate was now solvent, productive, and regarded by his peers with the particular respect afforded to a duke who has turned a failing inheritance into a working one. He had attended the expected social functions. He had not married, which had been the subject of sustained commentary from every quarter of his social circle for the better part of 3 years, and he had declined to address this commentary in any direct manner, which had the effect of making it louder. Lady Harriet Cavendish, daughter of the Earl of Rothbury, had been the expected woman since the autumn of 1841. She was beautiful, credentialed, and certain of her position in the way that a well-built bridge is certain of its own load capacity. She had been constructed for this purpose, and had no reason to doubt she could bear it. She had attended Ashford Park twice, presided over his London drawing room at his invitation on 4 separate social occasions, and had arranged her calendar around his in the quiet confidence of a woman who understood that certain things were simply a matter of time. Charles had not discouraged her with any directness. He had, instead, been punctual and polite and thoroughly elsewhere in the manner that he had developed for situations that required his social presence but not his actual attention. What had happened to him in Cavendish Square on that October Tuesday was something he was still measuring when he arrived at his study on Grosvenor Square and stood at the window and looked at the street below without seeing it. He had known, in an abstract way, that Arabella Vane was in London. He had known this for 2 years. He had not gone looking for the information. It had arrived in the course of his solicitor's routine work, because Pemberton Consulting had begun to acquire a small reputation among the families adjacent to his social circle. And when Edward Fanshawe had retired, the transfer of a consulting practice to a woman operating alone had generated the low, continuous murmur of comment that unusual arrangements generate in professional circles. He had filed this information in the same part of his mind where he kept things that required consideration before action, and he had left it there because he was a man who did not act until he understood exactly what he was acting toward. He understood it now. He had looked at her in the square, and she had held his gaze for 3 seconds. Exactly 3, he counted them, and then looked forward and walked on, and the quality of that moment was like a stone dropped into still water. The impact itself was brief, but the rings moved outward through everything. She had not changed in the way he had expected. He had anticipated, in the moments before recognition, the familiar markers of 5 years' time, some diminishment, some softening, some evidence of the compromises that most people made with the world by the time they were 27. He had found none of these things. What he had found instead was a woman who had become entirely and exactly herself, with nothing left over for performance. He had been extraordinary and invisible when he first saw her at her uncle's dinner table. She had been extraordinary and visible in Cavendish Square, and the combination of those 2 states in the same woman was something he had not encountered before and did not know how to set aside. He sat down at his desk. He wrote no letters. He had not been fair to her. He had known this for 5 years, with the specific clarity of a man who knows exactly when he made the wrong choice and cannot unknow it. He had offered her a professional arrangement and allowed the 18 months of it to become something that was not professional, without ever naming what it was. And when his father's oldest friend, Lord Colehurst, had stood in his study and explained, with the measured conviction of a man who believed he was preventing a mistake rather than committing one, that a duke who installed a penniless solicitor's daughter as a permanent fixture of his household and professional life was setting fire to the work of 3 generations, Charles had listened. He had not dismissed the argument. He had not made the argument he should have made, which was the one that began with, "I know exactly what she has built here, and I am not going to pretend I don't." Instead, he had thanked Lord Colehurst for his counsel. He had arranged for Arabella to receive a full settlement, 6 months additional compensation, and a letter of professional reference that he had written himself, with the particular thoroughness of a man trying to make right what he had not made right. He had sent these through his solicitor. He had not delivered them himself. He had not trusted himself to deliver them himself. She had not replied. He had not expected her to. What he had not anticipated was Cavendish Square, and 3 seconds of her gaze, and the quality of her composure, which was not the composure of a woman who had closed a door and locked it, but the composure of a woman who had built a new house and was living in it, completely and without apology. He sent a note that afternoon. He wrote it 3 times before he wrote a version he kept. It said, "Miss Vane, I am aware that you have no obligation to receive this. I would ask, if you are willing, for a meeting of your choosing, at a time and place of your choosing. I have something I should have said 5 years ago. If you prefer that I say nothing, I will respect that. Beaumont." He sent it to the Dover Street address. He did not know if she would reply. She read his note on Wednesday morning, between her 9 o'clock appointment and her 11 o'clock meeting with a tenant farm committee from the Lincolnshire estate of Lord Prentice, one of her 3 largest clients. She read it twice. She set it on her desk beside her appointment book and looked at it the way she looked at contracts that required careful interpretation. Not with distrust, not with eagerness, but with the precise, patient attention of a woman who knew that documents said both what they appeared to say and what they chose not to. She had managed more difficult things than this. She could manage this. She put the note in the left drawer of her desk, beneath the Prentice estate files, and went to her 11 o'clock meeting, and did not think about it again until the afternoon. She wrote back on Thursday. Her note said, "Mr. Beaumont, Friday, 2 o'clock, my office on Dover Street, Arabella Vane." She addressed him by name, not title. She was not going to perform deference she did not feel. Her ally in this particular difficulty, as in most of the difficulties she had encountered since establishing herself in London, was Cecily Drummond, who occupied the set of rooms directly above hers on Dover Street and ran a small but sharply observed letter-writing and translation service for clients, who found the diplomatic corners of commercial correspondence too fine for their own needles. Cecily had appeared in Arabella's life 18 months ago by knocking on the wrong door, and then, upon discovering her error, looking around Arabella's office with the frank, immediate inventory of a woman who was evaluating whether a person was worth knowing, and saying, "You've organized your shelves by document type and then by date within each type. That's either very useful or very anxious. Which is it?" Arabella had said useful, and Cecily had said good, and they had been friends by the end of the week in the particular way that women who are both occupied and perceptive become friends quickly, without ceremony, with considerable mutual usefulness, and with the specific warmth of 2 people who have both spent too long in rooms where no one quite saw them clearly. It was to Cecily that Arabella brought the news of Cavendish Square on the Wednesday evening, over tea and a cold supper of cheese and bread in Cecily's rooms. which were warmer than Arabella's and had a better stove. "He looked at you," Cecily said. "Everyone looks at other people in a public square." "He looked at you," Cecily repeated, with the precision of a woman who knew the difference between a statement and a correction. "And then he sent a note, which means he went home and thought about it and wrote 3 drafts before sending one. Men who send notes like that always write 3 drafts. You can't know that. I translate correspondence for a living. I know exactly that." Cecily poured more tea. "What are you going to do?" "I've already replied. Friday, 2 o'clock. My office." Cecily looked at her with the particular expression of someone who is satisfied with an answer and not going to press it further. "Your ground," she said. "Good." Also in the orbit of Arabella's life, and relevant to the Friday meeting in ways she was already calculating, was Edward Fanshawe, who had not retired entirely so much as retired from daily obligation, while retaining a considerable number of opinions. He still met with Arabella on the first Monday of each month, nominally to review the firm's broader strategy and in practice to drink tea and tell her when he thought she was about to make a mistake. He had the quality that very few people of senior position had, which was the capacity to say, "I was wrong about that," without requiring 15 minutes of preparatory qualification. He had been wrong about 3 things in Arabella's professional experience, and he had said so in each case without ceremony, and moved on, and she trusted him more precisely because of it. She did not tell him about Charles before Friday. She was not ready to say it aloud to anyone whose opinion she weighted as heavily as Edward's. Cecily she could manage. Edward would look at her with the specific attention of a man reading a document, and she was not prepared to be read like that, not yet. Friday came with a thin rain and a gray sky, and the smell of coal smoke from the buildings on either side of Dover Street. Arabella was at her desk by 8:30, which was her ordinary arrival time, and she worked through 2 client reviews and a letter to a creditor before the clock reached 10, and then she made herself stop reviewing Charles's note again and attend to the Lincolnshire Tenant Farm report instead, because she was not a woman who allowed her attention to scatter, and she was not going to become one. At 1:45 she put the Tenant Farm report in its folder, straightened the documents on her desk, placed her hands flat on the surface for a moment, and breathed. Her office was a room of modest proportions and considerable order. The shelves held 11 years of her professional life organized with the system she had built over 3 postings. The desk had been purchased second-hand from a retired bank manager's estate sale and was, in her estimation, the best desk she had ever worked at. Wide, solid, the surface slightly worn in a way that spoke of use rather than neglect. There were 2 client chairs across from her. The window looked onto Dover Street, the rain visible on the glass, the light flat and workmanlike and perfectly suited to the reading of fine print. She was behind this desk, in the chair that was hers, when Charles Beaumont arrived at 2 o'clock exactly. Her junior clerk, Thomas, showed him in and closed the door and withdrew, and for a moment the room held the particular quality of a space from which all other people have just been removed. He was the same. That was the first thing she registered, the same and yet more completely himself, the way she had seen in the square, a man who had grown into the outline he'd always had. He wore a dark coat, no ornamentation, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with the stillness that she had never seen him lose, even in the worst of the Ashford Park difficulties, when the tenant rolls had been 3 months in arrears, and the steward had presented falsified figures, and she had sat across from him in the estate office and gone through the real accounts line by line. He said, "Arabella." She said, "Please sit down." He sat. She did not move from behind her desk. She had considered whether this was strategic or simply practical, and had decided it was both, and saw no reason to apologize for either. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said precisely. "You said you had something to say." He looked at her with the measuring attention she remembered, not appraising, not calculating, but the look of a man who is reading something carefully because it matters. "I do," he said. "Several things. In order, if you'll allow it." She inclined her head. "The first is an apology," he said. "I should have said this 5 years ago, in person, rather than through a solicitor with a settlement that I arranged because I didn't trust myself to look at you directly and say what I should have said. I listened to Lord Colhurst's counsel. I had better arguments to make, and I chose not to make them, and what I did instead was unfair to you and dishonest about what those 18 months had been." She said nothing. She kept her hands still on the desk. "The second is a question," he said. "I know what you've built here. Edward Fanshaw's retirement notice and the transfer of his practice to your management were discussed in 3 separate legal circles I'm connected to, 11 clients, 2 clerks, a professional reputation that is almost entirely founded on documented results, because you built it without the social introductions that most advisory practices depend on. I know what that takes." He paused. "I would like to know if there is any version of a conversation between us that you are willing to have." Arabella looked at him for a moment. Outside, the rain moved against the window with a measured sound, like the tap of a finger on a ledger page. She said, "You're 3 years behind on that assessment. I had 11 clients 18 months ago. I have 14 now." Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who hadn't spent 18 months in the same estate office, but she had, and she saw it. "I stand corrected," he said. "As for the conversation," she said, "I'm having it. That's why you're here." She straightened one of the folders on her desk. "I want to be clear about something first. I don't require an apology, Mr. Beaumont. What you did was what most men of your position do when counsel from their peers conflicts with something they haven't named clearly enough to defend. I understand the mechanics of that situation. What I needed at the time was for you to choose differently, and you didn't, and I am not going to pretend I wasn't angry about it for quite a long time." He said, "Were you still angry in Cavendish Square?" She considered this with the same exactness she brought to every question that deserved precision. "No," she said. "I was something older than that." He held her gaze. He did not look away. "I was wondering," he said, "if I might call on you, in the proper form, as myself, not through a solicitor, and without any particular position from which I am asking anything, except the chance to begin again from an honest accounting." She looked at him the way she looked at any proposal, with the full attention it deserved and the patience to reach the end of it before responding. "You may call on Tuesday afternoon," she said, "between 3 and 5. Cecily Drummond is upstairs and will serve as adequate propriety." A pause. "Her door is always open and she hears everything." "I don't doubt it," he said. He stood. He did not offer his hand across the desk, which was the right choice, because the desk was between them and the distance was correct for where they were. He looked at her once more with that measuring attention that she had never seen him turn on anyone else, and then he said, "Thank you, Arabella," and left. She sat alone in her office for a long moment after the street door closed. She pressed one hand briefly against the warm wood of her desk. Then she opened the Lincolnshire Tenant Farm report and continued. Tuesday came, and then another Tuesday, and then several more, and the particular shape of those afternoons between 3 and 5 on Dover Street became a thing with its own gravity. Charles arrived punctually each time, which she had expected. He arrived with questions rather than observations, which she had not expected, or had expected once, years ago, in the estate office, but had put away with the rest of it. He asked about the mechanics of the Pemberton client accounts, and she answered with the directness she had always used, and he listened with the complete attention of a man who is not listening to be polite but to understand. Cecily's door remained open upstairs, and her footsteps occasionally crossed the ceiling in a pattern that Arabella recognized as deliberate restraint. He brought on the third Tuesday a document. It was a management agreement for a small property in Berkshire that one of his neighboring landowners had asked him to recommend an advisory firm for, and he placed it on her desk and said, "I told him you were the most operationally precise person I had ever worked with, and that if he didn't retain you, he would regret it within the quarter." She looked at the document, noted that it was a serious commission, looked at him and said, "You could have sent this through the ordinary referral." He said, "I could have. I preferred to bring it." She had 14 clients by the end of that month and would have 15 when she signed the Berkshire agreement. He came, on the 5th Tuesday, with something different in his posture. Not uncertainty, because that was not a state she had seen him occupy, but a kind of precision, the way a man is precise when he is being careful about something that matters. He said, "I owe you something more than an apology and a referral, Arabella." "You don't owe me anything in the transactional sense," she said. "I told you that." "I know what you told me," he said. "I'm telling you what I know." He sat in the client chair across from her desk with his hands resting easy on his knees, which she had learned, in those 18 months at Ashford Park, was his resting state when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a long time. "I hired an investigator 2 years ago, when Fanshaw's retirement was announced." She went still. "I wanted to know you were well. I wanted to know the work was sound and the firm was stable. Not because I thought you couldn't manage. I knew you could manage. I think I simply wanted evidence, the way I always want evidence before I act." He paused. "The report came back in 3 pages and told me you had built something that would outlast both our careers, and that you were entirely well and did not appear to require anything from anyone." He looked at her directly. "I was profoundly relieved and profoundly bereft in approximately equal measure, and I sat with both of those things for 2 years before I stood in Cavendish Square and looked at you and understood that I had been wrong to sit with them instead of acting." She had managed creditor negotiations. She had rearranged households. She had built a consulting practice from a single referral and a retired solicitor's careful eye. She was very good at not letting the thing she was feeling move into her face ahead of her. She said, "You hired someone to check that I was all right." "Yes." 2 years ago. "Yes. And you have been sitting with the report for 2 years." "I have." She looked at him across the desk with the particular stillness that was, in her, the sign of feeling something strongly enough that she needed a moment before the words. Then she said, "That is the most thorough and completely inefficient form of caring about someone I have ever encountered." Something moved in his expression that might, on another face, have been a laugh. "I'm aware." "You could have written a note," she said, 18 months ago. "I could have." He met her eyes. "I was afraid of exactly what I found in the square, that you had built your life without any remaining space for this, and that seeing it would be a thing I deserved and could not argue with." She thought about this with the full, unhurried attention she gave to every question that deserved it. Outside, the November afternoon had gone almost dark, the gas lamps on Dover Street coming up one by one, the light catching the rain-wet stones. Her office was warm. Her desk was solid beneath her hands. "You haven't asked me anything," she said. "No," he agreed. "I haven't. I don't yet have the right." She looked at him for a long moment. "Tuesday fortnight," she said. "The Cavendish Square Assembly have their autumn charity concert. Cecily has 2 tickets and doesn't want them. Come to that." He held her gaze. "I'll come to that," he said. The trouble with Lady Harriet Cavendish was not that she was unpleasant. She was, in fact, perfectly pleasant in the managed, practiced way of a woman who had been trained to make a room comfortable for herself without appearing to do so. The trouble was that she was present at the Cavendish Square Assembly concert, accompanied by her mother, the Countess of Rothbury, and that she saw Charles arrive with Arabella and registered the fact with the particular stillness of a woman recalibrating a calculation she had believed was settled. Arabella noted all of this in the first 3 minutes of entering the hall. She also noted Cecily at her elbow, already identifying the seating arrangement and its social topology with the focused pleasure of a woman who genuinely enjoyed knowing where everyone was placed, and she noted the room itself. The hall was full, lit by 2 banks of candles in iron holders along the walls, the kind of light that made everything look like a painting of itself. There was a pianoforte on the small stage, a string quartet tuning in the corner, and a murmur of social conversation filling the space in the way that such conversation always fills spaces, like water finding its level. Charles stood beside her in the way that he occupied space, which was without encroachment, present, definite, not performing anything. Lady Harriet arrived at them within 4 minutes. She was beautiful, which was not in question. Dark hair, pale skin, a gown the color of Wedgwood blue that had been chosen to make her look precisely as she looked, which was the kind of considered effort that looked like effortlessness and required a great deal of both. She looked at Arabella with the focused, assessing attention of a woman who has just understood that she has been mistaken about the composition of a room. "Your Grace," she said to Charles, and then, to Arabella, with a smile that was perfectly shaped, "I don't believe we've been introduced. I am Lady Harriet Cavendish." "Arabella Vane," Arabella said. Miss Vane." The smile did not change its shape. "Are you a great friend of the Assembly? I confess I haven't seen you at these events before." "I have attended several," Arabella said. "I find the evening programs of more interest than the social season functions. The musicians they engage are generally working professionals rather than accomplished amateurs, and the difference in precision is considerable." A small pause. "Quite," said Lady Harriet. She turned to Charles with a redirect that was technically graceful. "I had hoped to speak with you about the Rothbury Estate Committee's proposal. Your father's old advisory connection, Lord Colehurst, suggested your involvement might be beneficial." "Lord Colehurst is retired," Charles said. "His advisory connections with my household ceased 3 years ago." Another small pause. "Of course," said Lady Harriet. "I had not realized." She looked once more at Arabella, briefly and without heat, and made the assessment that showed in the particular quality of her expression. Not defeated, not angry, but recalibrating, like an adding machine that has just received new figures. Then she withdrew, gracefully, to the far side of the room, and Arabella watched her go and felt nothing theatrical about it, only the clean, functional respect one operational mind had for another, moving on to better calculations. "Lord Colehurst," Arabella said quietly to Charles. "Yes," he said. "He is the one who advised you 5 years ago." "Yes." She absorbed this. "He was wrong," she said. "But he was not dishonest. He told you what he believed." "He was wrong," Charles said, with the simple finality of a man who had arrived at a conclusion 3 years ago and had no intention of revisiting the journey. "And I was a coward. Those are separate facts, and I don't intend to confuse them." The quartet began to play. She turned toward the stage. She did not reach for his hand. He did not take hers, but they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence at her shoulder, like weather coming in from a direction she had turned to face. The concert ran to 3 hours, with an interval, and at the interval she was approached by a woman named Mrs. Alderton, wife of a wool broker whose accounts she managed, who expressed loud and genuine surprise at seeing her there, and then looked at Charles with a slow recognition that moved across her face like a tide, and said nothing but adjusted her evaluation of Arabella visibly and permanently. It was not the largest room she would stand in, but it was the first one where she stood in it as herself, completely, with no performance required and no invisible work to do, and the quality of that was something she did not examine. The way she did not examine things she was not ready to put into accounts. She would put them in accounts later. The difficulty that required accounting came not from Lady Harriet, who retreated from the field with more dignity than Arabella might have expected, but from Lord Colehurst himself, who appeared at a professional gathering of estate advisors and management consultants in January, where Arabella had been asked, by two separate clients, to present the methodology she had developed for tenant farm restructuring. It was a small but respectable assembly. 11 professionals, a handful of landowning clients, and 2 gentlemen from a legal firm who had come to observe what the industry was doing with its creditor frameworks. Lord Colehurst was there because one of the client landowners was his cousin. He was 71 years old, with the bearing of a man who had spent 60 of those years being right about things, which had made him very certain and occasionally very wrong. He looked at Arabella when she entered the room with the expression of a man performing a recognition that surprises him, and she thought, "He knows who I am," and she thought, "He did not know I would be here," and she thought, "Good, present the work. Let the work speak at its own volume." She presented for 40 minutes. She had 41 pages of annotated accounts, 3 estate case studies, and a methodology document that she had written over the course of a year and revised 7 times, and she put the material on the table in front of her and worked through it with the pace of a woman who has been explaining precise things to skeptical audiences for 8 years and has long since stopped requiring them to meet her halfway. The figures were real. The tenant farm reorganization at Lincolnshire had recovered £340 annually in revenue that had been lost to unstructured arrangement. The creditor framework she had built for a Hertfordshire estate had reduced carrying costs by 1/5 over 2 years. The numbers were on the page, with their dates and their auditor's verification notes, and she presented them in the order that built the largest case, and she did not hurry. The room was quiet in a way that had weight. Lord Colehurst asked one question at the conclusion. He said, "The tenant restructuring methodology, is this your own development or adapted from an existing model?" She said, "My own. It is derived from an early version I built for the Ashford Park estate in 1838 and 1839, which I developed in response to a specific set of arrears and steward irregularities. The framework has been refined through 8 subsequent applications." Lord Colehurst looked at her with the expression of a man reading a document he has already formed an opinion of, and then discovering that the document contains different figures than he expected. He said, "Ashford Park. That would be Beaumont's estate." "Yes," she said. He said nothing further for a moment. Then, quietly, without performing it, without warmth and without contempt, he said, "The methodology is sound. I withdrew the wrong conclusion from the wrong evidence in the matter of that estate, and I appear to have been doing so for some time." He paused. "The Lincolnshire recovery figures are convincing." The room was silent. "Thank you," Arabella said, and returned to her place, and the meeting continued. She picked up her list and carried on. It was afterward in the corridor that she encountered Lord Colehurst alone for a moment, pulling on his gloves with the deliberate attention of a man managing his own feelings through the activity of ordinary things. He said without looking at her, "You should know that I was not ill-intentioned. I was incorrect. There is a distinction." "I know that," she said. "I have held the distinction for 5 years. He looked at her then, with the specific attention of a man who is seeing something clearly that he has been looking at sideways for a long time. He put on his second glove. He said, "Good afternoon, Miss Vane," and walked away down the corridor, and Arabella stood for a moment with one hand briefly against the cool plaster of the wall, and then walked the other direction, toward the street. Charles was waiting outside. She had not expected him. He had not said he would be there. He was standing on the pavement with no hat, his coat collar turned up against the January cold, and when she came through the door he straightened in a way that was not performance but simple attention, like a compass needle settling. She said, "Were you in there?" "No," he said. "I walked Cecily's commission to the printers on St. Martin's Lane and came past." A pause. "That is true. I was also aware this was today." She looked at him with the patience she used for things that were worth looking at correctly. "Lord Colehurst was there," she said. "I know." He acknowledged the error, partially, in his way. Charles was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He came to see me in December. He said he had looked at the Pemberton consulting records in the course of some professional business, and that he believed he had been insufficiently thorough in his counsel to me, 5 years ago, regarding the professional capabilities of certain persons." A pause. "He said it exactly like that." She almost laughed. She did not quite, but it was close. "That is the most armored acknowledgment I have ever heard described. He is a man of considerable armor," Charles said. "But he did come." He looked at her steadily. "He came, Arabella." She thought about this. The January air was cold and clean and smelled of the city and coal smoke and the damp stone of the street, and Charles was standing in it without a hat like a man who had not planned to wait in the cold, and had waited anyway, and the morning had been exactly what she had built it to be, her figures, her methodology, her name on the documents, and Lord Colehurst had said it was sound, and the room had been changed by the fact of her standing in it. She had been waiting to be seen for a long time. She had stopped requiring it from the world, but the world had looked, and the looking was its own accounting. She said, "Come to dinner. Not a formal thing. Dover Street, 7 o'clock. Cecily will be there, and Thomas will have gone home, and I have a very adequate stove." He said simply, "Yes." He came at 7. Cecily was already there, having arrived at 6:30 with bread and a cheese she had been saving for a significant occasion, which she announced with the complete absence of ceremony that was her most endearing quality. The three of them ate in Arabella's sitting room, which was next to the office and was warm and quietly furnished, and Charles sat in the chair by the window with a glass of wine and talked to Cecily about the letter-writing trade and its intersection with the legal correspondence market, which he apparently knew something about, and Cecily, who respected competence above almost everything, revised her opinion of him over the course of the soup and had arrived, by the cheese, at something approaching approval. At 9 o'clock Cecily said good night and went upstairs, and the sitting room held the quiet of a place from which all performance has withdrawn. Charles said, "I would like to say something." "Say it," she said. He looked at her from the chair by the window with the complete, specific attention that she had always known him to have and had never stopped thinking about, the attention that was like a room being fully lit, like a ledger that balances. He said, "Not because I owe you something, not because the social circumstance has made it convenient or appropriate or because this is the rational next arrangement after Cavendish Square and December and January and everything between, but because for 5 years I have been a man with a specific understanding of what I had let go, and the understanding has not diminished, and I am not willing to be that man any longer." He paused. "I would like to marry you, Arabella, if you are willing, if you find, on full and careful consideration, that you want this." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the coal merchant and the corrected contract. She thought about her father in his study on Sunday afternoons. She thought about Edward Fanshawe reading her annotated accounts with the specific attention of a man who was encountering something real. She thought about 14 clients and 2 clerks and the desk she had bought with her own money from her own account, and the coat the color of pewter, and 3 seconds in Cavendish Square, and Lord Colehurst's armored acknowledgment, and Charles standing on a cold pavement without a hat, because he had been aware that today was today. She thought about all of this at the pace it deserved. Then she said, "Yes, on the condition that the arrangement of Pemberton Consulting remains my arrangement. The firm is mine." He said, "I would not touch that firm. It is one of the best-run professional practices in London, and it is entirely yours." "Good," she said. He did not cross the room. The distance was correct for the moment, and they both understood this. But he looked at her with the warmth of a man who has just been given back something he had not been certain he would see again. And she looked at him with the honest, clear-eyed warmth of a woman who has considered something completely and decided on it without reservation, and that was the whole of what was needed. The wedding was in March, small and practical in the church on Grosvenor Square, with Cecily as witness and Edward Fanshawe, who cried twice and denied both times. Thomas, her clerk, pressed his best coat into service and stood very straight. There was no announcement in the society pages until the following week, because Arabella had asked for the quiet first, and Charles had simply agreed. There was a moment, in the vestibule, before the ceremony, when he straightened his cravat twice, and she watched and did not intervene. And then, on the third adjustment, she reached up and settled it with 3 precise movements and said, "It was crooked for the last 4 years as well. I simply wasn't positioned to say so." He looked at her, and the warmth in his expression was the kind that does not need to perform itself. "You were positioned," he said. "I wasn't listening correctly." "You are now," she said. He was. They moved, in the autumn of that year, between Grosvenor Square and Ashford Park in Wiltshire, with the orderly rotation of people who have each, separately, built a life, and are now combining 2 lives with the attention that the operation deserves. Ashford Park was exactly what her early accounts had built: solvent, stable, the tenant farms running on the restructured framework she had designed in 1838 and revised twice since. The household managed with a precision that the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Bramley, had maintained with the specific loyalty of someone who understood what it meant to work in a house that was well managed. Mrs. Bramley had welcomed Arabella on her first arrival as the Duchess with the particular, unperformed warmth of a woman who had read the account books and understood immediately who had written the system she had been living inside. "I've followed your margin notes in the household ledgers for 6 years, she said, the first morning, over the account books. Thought they must belong to a person worth meeting. "All the notes are numbered by quarter," Arabella said. "If you find an inconsistency in the method, annotate it and I'll revise." Mrs. Bramley smiled the smile of a woman who has found what she was looking for. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. Pemberton Consulting remained on Dover Street with Thomas in charge of daily operations and a second clerk hired in the autumn. Arabella traveled to London twice each month and was present in the office for 5 days each visit, and the practice did not diminish in her management. It grew because results continued to grow, and the word of mouth that had always been her only marketing moved steadily through the circles of the minor gentry and the professional merchant class, and by the following year she had 17 clients. The methodology document from the January presentation had been requested, in copied form, by 4 neighboring estates in Wiltshire. She had provided it with a covering letter that set out the conditions of use, and 3 of the 4 had implemented the framework and reported measurable recoveries. The 4th had not implemented it and had reported nothing, which was also information. Charles watched all of this with the attention he had always had, which was complete and specific and quiet, and he was not decorative about it. He read the quarterly reports she prepared. He attended, twice, to her meetings with the Lincolnshire clients when she had asked for his presence as a professional endorsement, and he had provided the endorsement straightforwardly and without performance, and then stepped back, because he understood what stepping back meant in these situations, and he did so without requiring her to ask. Their daughter was born in December of the 2nd year. They named her Marin, which was Arabella's mother's name and also, as it happened, the name of a village in Wiltshire 2 miles from the estate boundary. which Charles pointed out with the quiet satisfaction of a coincidence that feels like a decision. Marin had Charles's gravity and Arabella's precision, which produced, in a child of 14 months, a person who moved through the house with a focused sense of purpose that was not purposive in any actual direction, but felt extremely organized. She had a specific preference for the account ledgers, which she had identified as large, heavy, fascinating, and also forbidden, which made them ideal. She could not yet lift them, but she could indicate her intentions very clearly, and the housekeeper's cat, who was old and magnificent and entirely unimpressed by the child's strategies, had taken up a position near the ledger shelf as a kind of informal guardian, which was not an arrangement anyone had designed, but which had become, through use, permanent. On a Tuesday morning in February, Arabella sat at the desk in the Ashford Park study, which had been reorganized, in her first week of permanent residence, to something that actually functioned, and reviewed the first quarter accounts with the particular pleasure she had always taken in figures that told the truth without apology. The fire was lit. The rain was on the window. The household was going about its business in the orderly, unhurried way of a place that knows how it is organized and by whom. She was aware, at a certain point, that Charles had come into the room. She did not look up for a moment, because the margin she was checking required the end of the row, and she finished it and made the notation, and then looked up. He was standing by the window with Marin balanced in the crook of his arm, which was where Marin had decided to be, because she had also decided, at some point in the last 3 weeks, that the window was the most interesting part of any room, and that his arm was the correct elevation from which to assess it. He was looking at Arabella. She knew the quality of that particular looking, which was the complete, specific, entirely unperformed attention of a man who had spent 5 years understanding something and was not going to waste his understanding now. She looked back at him across the room. Marin made a sound of interested inquiry at the window, which neither of them addressed because the window was fine and she was fine, and the accounts were complete for the morning, and the fire was warm, and the life that Arabella Vane had built, with her own accounts, her own amendments, her own annotated ledgers, her own precise and unhurried hand, was the life she had decided on, at full consideration, without reservation, and she was entirely inside it. She picked up her pen and wrote the final entry, and the morning continued.